Welcome to the award-winning Consumer Finance Monitor podcast, where we explore important new developments in the world of consumer financial services and what they mean for your business, your customers, and the industry. This is a weekly show brought to you by the Consumer Financial Services Group at the Ballard Spahr Law Firm. And I'm your host, Alan Kaplinsky, the former practice group leader for 25 years, and now senior counsel of the Consumer Financial Services Group at Ballard Spahr. And I'm pleased to be moderating today's program. For those of you who want even more information, either about the topic that we're going to discuss today, or for that matter, anything else in the world of consumer finance, don't forget to subscribe to our blog, which also goes by the name of Consumer Finance Monitor. We've hosted our blog since 2011, when the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau first became operational. So there is a lot of relevant industry content there. We also regularly host webinars on subjects of interest to those in the industry. So to subscribe to our blog or to get on the list for our webinars, please visit us at ballardspahr.com. And if you like our podcast, please let us know about it. You can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you obtain your podcasts. Also, please let us know if you have ideas for any other topics that we should consider covering or speakers that we should consider as guests on our show. Well, today we are going to visit a subject that we haven't really covered in quite some time. And the topic is artificial intelligence, and we're going to refer to it pretty often as AI. We have done prior podcasts on that subject, but it's been a while. There's been so much going on at the CFPB, and ever since Trump was sworn in on January 20th of this year, so many things happening in the world of consumer finance. We're happy that we're finally talking about a completely different subject, or I won't say completely different, but it's not going to just be about the CFPB. So we're talking about artificial intelligence, and in particular, what has been going on both at the federal level and at the state level. And we want you from the standpoint of a company engaged in the consumer finance business. That could be a bank or it could be a non-bank. And one of the things that we'll focus on, as well as what's happening at the federal level, is what's going on at the state level. You know, how many states have enacted AI-specific legislation? And let me caution you that we're not going to be talking about existing statutes, consumer finance regulations, or consumer protection regulations that aren't specifically devoted to AI. I often have to remind clients that are engaging in something involving AI that it's not the wild, wild west. There are existing statutes, some of which have been on the books for decades, that apply to AI. But that's not what we're going to be focusing on today. We're going to be talking about the AI-specific statutes. And one of the things that we'll be talking about is something that happened very recently, where President Trump issued what I call is a white paper of sorts, or a blueprint, what he thinks needs to be done at the federal level regarding AI. It's called Winning the Race, America's AI Action Plan. So, with that introduction, let me now introduce our very special guest, who is an expert in this area, and it's Pat Utz. He is CEO and co-founder of a company called Abstract. He founded Abstract alongside Matthew Chang, the chief operating officer, and Mohammed Hayat, the chief technology officer, in 2020. And he's since grown into a venture capital backed AI company with teams in New York, where they have their headquarters, and Los Angeles. As a first generation American, Pat is passionate about increasing equitability by making complex data sets accessible to the general public. Much of this fascination comes from his parents, who immigrated to the United States after having dabbled in Argentine politics for a while. And I can imagine that was pretty interesting. Pat was named to the 2023 Forbes 30 Under 30 Los Angeles for being at the forefront of AI-powered disruption in legal tech. So, Pat, a very warm welcome to you. Really delighted to have you on our program today.
Likewise. Thank you, Alan, for having me on, and really excited to talk about AI, but hopefully shed some light on what's going to happen moving forward and sort of what's already happened. So really excited for this conversation.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let's start at the federal level, Pat. And I already referenced the white paper that President Trump issued very recently, Winning the Race, America's AI Action Plan. We're not going to talk about everything, obviously, in that white paper. That would we could easily take up the whole hour talking about everything. But I want to find out, what does it say about existing or future state AI statutes?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at sort of what's gone on, so Biden, as you can't forget too quickly, had released his own sort of sets of rules through his sets of executive orders on AI. And that was very much focused on keeping safety and guardrails in mind as we entered this new world of AI. And let me be clear, the sort of AI that we're talking about is largely categorized under the probabilistic AI, that's large language models. So what we're talking, because AI has been around for decades, right? And we've used the term AI to describe more deterministic models, which we'll talk about later. But a lot of this regulation, a lot of this buzz is around sort of what was unlocked with ChatGPT 3.5, which was using these large language models that rely on probability to essentially create what we call fancy autocomplete, right? And this is the sort of magical, quote unquote, AI that we've been seeing with ChatGPT and other foundational models like that from Anthropic and Google and Meta. So just to clarify, that executive order from Biden came out earlier. That was obviously sort of canceled and now replaced with Trump's executive order on AI that, in broad strokes, without getting super deep into it, is essentially aiming to keep AI innovation up and to the right and lay high-level frameworks such that states that do not, sort of align with those frameworks do not receive funding. So it's a very interesting tactic that they're deploying here, where they're essentially saying, hey, the states that decide to go, against our framework here, they're not going to receive federal funding, which is going to have downstream effects for the companies that are innovating in those states.
Right. So they first tried to do something like that in the big, beautiful bill, didn't they? There was something added as an amendment, I think, in the Senate. And then the Senate parliamentarian concluded that it was not appropriate for this appropriations budget because in order to be able to enact the legislation with just a majority in the Senate rather than 60 votes, it had to be determined by the Senate parliamentarian that it related very much to the budget of the country, and it was knocked out, and so it didn't actually become part of the statute. And he went about it by coming up with this white paper and issuing an executive order. I got that right? And it doesn't call for preemption of state AI laws, that is, that they're all overridden, but there are things in this white paper that perhaps might override some of the state laws if they're too heavy-handed. And because there's definitely, I guess one of the ways I would look at it, it differs from Biden's plan in that Biden was very heavy on regulating, making sure there were guardrails and appropriate consumer protections. This new plan is much more AI friendly and not quite as worried about, regulating AI. Would you say that fairly characterized?
In broad strokes, what they're doing is they're saying if you regulate AI too heavily, we're going to slap you on the wrist by taking funding away for energy, like data centers and energy infrastructure projects, etc. Right, federal funding.
Yeah. So as a practical matter, I don't think any state would be able to do that. I mean, would be able to absorb that financial hit, I would think, right?
That's what we think, right? But the interesting piece here is that California and New York are usually the two states that lead everyone in terms of policy that's new. And so the sort of standards that California set with the CCPA, right, around consumer privacy, the rest of the states sort of followed suit in one way or another, right? California is home to most of the foundational model companies, right? OpenAI, Anthropic, Perplexity, etc. So what's interesting is that, I don't see California necessarily saying, hey, we're just going to fully deregulate this to comply with the federal government. I think what's going to happen is larger states, specifically California, New York, maybe Colorado, they're going to go forth with their regulatory frameworks. And then any sort of fights with, federal funding, it's likely going to go to court, as we've been seeing with all these other issues between the state and the executive branch. Yes.
Yeah, that's I think you're absolutely right there. So you mentioned a couple of states already that I assume have AI specific statutes: California, New York. What other ones? There aren't too many, are there, that actually have statutes on the books?
I would say some of the key states that, and we've been working with associations like the Consumer Technology Association that's been tracking this very closely as well. And we'd say that Utah has quite a new list of definitions around using Gen AI for customer service applications and sort of having to tell the customer that you're talking to an AI if it is AI powered. So Utah's a big one. Colorado as well. So Colorado, in the case of high risk applications, meaning using these large language models for figuring out whether or not to give somebody a loan, right? That's a high risk to the consumer. Their new set of statutes, sort of dictate that those companies need to show how they're training those models, show how they're making those decisions around the loans or the credit scoring, et cetera. So I would say Colorado is another big one with their AI Act.
So you've got 4 states already, and pretty significant states. I mean, perhaps Utah may be the least significant because doesn't have the population. It's not as large as any of the other states, particularly California and New York. But I also assume that there are a number of states that have bills that are pending now or bills that have been introduced during past legislative sessions that would also, if enacted, would be considered to be AI specific statutes, right?
Yeah, and this is going back to my prior point where usually California and New York set a precedent with, new bill that turns into law, and then all the other states follow. So some of the other key states are Connecticut, Arkansas, and Alaska. All of them have different flavors of what California has made around, first and foremost, sort of protecting the use of AI for anything that's malicious, right, such as child pornography. That's all pretty consistent. But then we're also seeing, Alaska really, lean into the deep fakes and creating a task force to identify deep fakes. So it's the Wild West. I believe the number right now is about 40. 40 of the states all have some sort of set of AI bills that they're working through in the legislatures.
Yeah. Are they generally, at least based on your past experience in tracking these bills, Pat, are they generally bills that are introduced by the Democrats with the Republicans generally resisting them? Is that the pattern?
So we've seen quite often bipartisan effort across most of the states, if not in some cases, to no surprise, the Republicans sort of pushing more towards the pro business, pro innovation side. Dems fall into more of sort of like regulating it more fully, but we've seen it be supported on both ends, right? I would say what's going to be interesting is how each of the parties sort of take view on disclosures of where AI is used, because that's going to impact businesses in different ways, right? Sort of putting more burden for businesses to disclose that they're using AI. It's going to be more burdensome for smaller businesses as well to have to comply by that. So I think there's going to be a divide there. I think in terms of the consumer safety piece, such as not using it for deep fakes and whatnot, I think that's a bipartisan agreement. But another, last point here is also sort of whether we lean into open sourcing AI models or keeping it closed source. We're starting to see more of a shift there between the lines. Trump's executive order pushes for open source models, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, explain, if you would, what's the difference between an open source and a closed source?
Yeah, definitely. So right now, the way these large language models work is they're trained on vast sets of training data across the internet or specific types of industries. And after the model is trained, it has various what we call weights that are fine-tuned by that training process. And with each iteration, these models are getting much more intelligent. GPT-5 is coming out soon from OpenAI. And, there's a lot of promise in terms of what that's going to be able to do for us. But long story made short, open sourcing means that the guts of the model are open to the public, which would enable smaller companies, especially companies that are venture backed, to be able to take those models, fine tune it themselves, and innovate quicker. Whereas closed source means, hey, if you need to use this model, you have to pay a fee to OpenAI, as an example, to be able to use the model, and you can't really open it apart and see what's going on the inside.
I got it. And you're in the white paper issued by Trump supports open source,
leaning towards open source, not fully outright, but yes, definitely having more of a preference towards that. The thing is that closed source allows for it's easier to regulate, so we'll see what's play out.
So let me ask you this: do you think that President Trump's funding pressure on the states that have stricter AI laws could effectively override any need for formal federal preemption? Or does the case for national standards and federal preemption still remain strong?
It's a great question. So the EU is, again, ahead of us in this. Like they've already created a set of EU-wide laws around AI, which is what's causing the headaches for a lot of larger companies. I think at least throughout Trump's term, there's not going to be a legislative, i.e. Congress, coming through with a bill that becomes a law for national standards. I think ultimately what's going to happen is the states with more defined, more strict set of rules like California are going to set the standard, and companies are going to want to just adhere to that so that they are good to go with the rest of the states. I don't foresee a national standard being created in the next 4 years.
It will take probably some crisis of some sort in order for the federal government to act. At least that's the feeling I have. And, that's usually the federal government is behind the states. They're more reactive than proactive. So how do these diverging state AI laws affect banks, fintechs, and lenders that rely on AI for credit scoring, credit underwriting, for loans, fraud detection, and customer service, especially now that any federal guardrails may be almost non-existent or at least a lot weaker?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's break that down, right? So I would say the area in which generative AI, right, AI with these large language models is having the most impact in right now is customer service. So they're able to take all this training data of past call logs, interacting with customers, train these large language models with that information, and just let that AI take care of all the frustrated customer requests that come in. So I think that's where we're starting to see the first set of clear standards being created, with Utah surprisingly leading that out. And first and foremost, they have to essentially, if you're using AI to answer customer calls, you have to announce that you're using AI. So it's more so just being clear about that. But then more importantly, it's the training data. And this is where California's AI law, or newly made AI law, requires companies to sort of disclose the training data, right, that they're using to train that customer service AI module. And that training data usually involves customer logs, et cetera, right? And so that's where you get into the consumer privacy piece, which is what are the records, right, from consumers that you're using to train that central tool, right, to answer all these customer requests. So I foresee that in the customer success field, it's going to be a lot more disclosure around, are we using AI or not, right? Having that disclosure to your customers. Also requiring customers to agree to, of course, let their data be this is a call that's recorded, maybe used for training and monitoring purposes. And so that is where that's going to go. Now, in terms of scoring and lending, this is interesting, right? Because
before you go to those areas, I do want to get to them. They're very important. But let's say with customer service for a minute. So we all have the experience of calling, any major company, whether it's a bank or a major retailer. You hardly ever have a human answer the phone right away. That just doesn't happen. You get what I've always called a voice response unit. Is that a crude type of AI, or is that something else?
Yeah, so that is a non-large language model, so a non-probabilistic model type of system, right? We call it more of a deterministic system, which is, hey, Alan said this, so if he says this, I need to respond with this. If not, respond, right? It's a deterministic decision. We call it decision tree, right? So that is a different set of tooling that is outside the scope.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, are there companies today that are using large language models for customer service, or are they still in their infancy, I guess, and haven't really been born yet, or barely born?
Yeah, they are. So infancy in terms of being pushed to production, being pushed to
that actually are in use. Are there some companies that are doing it?
I would say that it's, as we speak, has already been rolled out across many small, medium enterprises, and it's working its way up to the larger enterprises. One of the big providers of this is Intercom. Intercom has released a tool called Fin, And Fin uses large language models to ingest all the call logs and context, right, about the business. And so when a customer asks Fin a question, it's able to organically respond to it like a human. For anyone, listening to this, I highly recommend playing around with ChatGPT's new voice assistant and just listen to how the voice assistant responds to you. You can't tell that it's a robot. It sounds like a human, right? So we're going to see this, in the next 12 to 24 months, I would say, be quite normal. And again, this differs from the very monotonous, auto responders.
Yeah. If you want this, press 1. If you're calling about this, press 2. And and it's often very frustrating because it never, or sometimes they'll say, what are you calling about? And sometimes it's hard to say the magic words. If you don't say the magic words, then they ask you to repeat it again. Tell me what you're calling about.
Exactly. So that is not, so we are talking about the next level here, right? And so these models, it's just like talking to a human. The reason why this legislation is important is because these models they're talking with you, right? And so as you talk with it, they're going to take in that information, process it through all of their millions, if not trillions of weights. And so the question is, where is that processed? Is that information being sent to OpenAI? Or is it being sent to, another model that is owned by China, right? And now your information's in China, right? And so this is why this is really important to have guidelines as to where those models are taking that data and processing it.
I see. Okay. All right. Let's turn now to the topic of credit scoring or credit underwriting, and tell us about what's going on there.
Yeah. So this is interesting. With traditional methods of creating these scores and reports, over the past couple of decades, we've really leaned into deterministic mathematical models to figure out, what a credit score should be, right, for individual, or should they be allowed to, buy this house with X%, right, of interest. So these mathematical models are deterministic, which means that they're a set of equations that say, okay, if they make this much money and they live in this zip code and they have these many children, that equals Y, right, in terms of a percentage. So it's all deterministic. The issue is that with a lot of inputs, these deterministic models are really hard to control because with a lot of inputs, it requires a lot of fine-tuning inside. So this is where if you lean into probabilistic models like these AI LLMs, you're able to give it a lot more inputs, right? You're able to give it all the information about this person's, spend, their, what they're following on social media, right? Different information from ads. And all this data is able to be processed by these large language models using probability. And that gets you to, a different set of conclusions as to whether or not they should be approved, right, for this mortgage. The issue is that, so the positive is that these models can process a lot more information, right? So you can give it a lot more of a grander picture of a person's profile to determine whether or not they're, eligible for this mortgage. The downside is that we still don't have very clear methods of showing how these models come to that conclusion. If you tell ChatGPT all this information and then ask it, explain to me how you came to this, it's still not a standardized process, right? Showing how the model reasons. And the reason why that is not possible right now is because these models have millions, if not trillions, of weights, right? So there's just a lot of inner pieces working with one another using different probabilities to come to that conclusion. And we don't have a straightforward way of presenting that. And so when it comes to regulatory standards, the governments want to have companies tell them, hey, how'd you come to this conclusion, right? And it's really hard to show that.
Well, you're required under a different statute, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and Regulation B of the promulgated by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. If you turn somebody down, you've got to give an adverse action notice. You have to say, we're declining you, and you've got to give a principal reason why you're declining the individual. And that's where it's difficult, right?
Yep. Now, what we do have access to is allowing the models to tell us where they're pulling the information from, right? Which that is important. If you're in the, in this space in finance, like making sure that all the data sets you're using for these models are properly labeled. You're using methods like, we call it RAG, retrieval augmented generation, where the model is clearly retrieving data from certain parts of your system so that you have an audit trail, you have a trail of information as to, hey, this is how we came to this conclusion and it used this information, right? But if you then go deeper and say, okay, but why, right? Tell me your reasoning. That's what's actively being worked on by a plethora of smart.
Right. And there's another area that the equal credit opportunity covers, and that is you can't discriminate against somebody that's in a protected class, such as what race they are, what religion they are, what gender they are, and there are a number of other protected classes. And so you've got to, again, be careful that your AI model isn't discriminating against somebody based on that person's status of being in a protected class.
Yep. And that's why, where we're trending towards is having these models for the sake of scoring, right, purposes, as they reason through, whether or not somebody should get a mortgage, listing out each of the steps, right? And then creating guardrails. And so this is a practice that's becoming common in the AI space, where prompt engineers set guardrails for the models. So the guardrail can say, hey, these are the protected classes. As you're reasoning through this, let me know if you identified any of these protected classes and whether or not this was taken into account. So you can make that a guardrail or required step every time the AI model reasons through everything. So this is where this is going to trend towards. And again, it's preferred over deterministic models because you can just give it a lot more data, a lot more context.
Right. The plan, that is Trump's America's AI Action Plan, it doesn't address sector-specific AI use in finance, lending, or credit. Am I right?
Correct.
It doesn't get into that.
It does not. Along with many other industries, but yes.
Many other things, right? Let's go back to the area of fraud detection. That was the third area that you mentioned. What's happening there?
Yeah, so on the fraud detection piece, it's actually similar to the scoring aspect where, in order to detect if there's fraud, you require a lot of data to be processed quickly. And I would say it's a similar case, right, where you need to make sure that these models are explaining how they're reasoning through all that data to ensure that the fraud is not misclassified, right? And so I think we're going to see a lot of that happen. I think California's, again, Gen AI training data transparency law, which is a mouthful, but that's the official terminology. It requires for companies to show like what the models are being trained on, right? So in the case of fraud, companies are going to be required to disclose, hey, these are all the data sets that we typically use for fraud detection. And this is what we're using, right? Which again ties into consumer privacy, CCPA related compliance issues.
Right. Okay. So what is, at the federal level, they refer in the plan to something called high-risk AI. What is high-risk AI?
So high-risk AI, as understood now, is AI that's used in a way that presents a higher risk to consumers, right? So fraud detection and scoring is a form of high-risk AI because the output of that model can, potentially, enable or disable you to buy a home, right? That's pretty high risk, right, to the consumer. So that's what they mean by that.
And can you explain how can companies consistently assess which systems fall under stricter state standards, like I think you said Colorado or Utah?
Yeah. So a couple of things here. As we say, it all comes down to resources, right? So, with less resources, the suggestion is adhering to the stricter sort of standards, which will likely continue to be set by California, Colorado, and New York. But really, the proper way of doing this is just having, access to all of the bills and laws, and then figuring out how does that compare to your internal processes. And so this is where there are tools out there. There's law firms, lobbying firms, right, that will provide this service. It's also the area that we specialize in at Abstract. We use AI, metaphorically or literally, to figure out how AI laws may impact a business's operations, right? So leaning into those sort of tools is going to be critical, especially as the patchwork continues to be.
Right. So as AI is increasingly used in credit and lending, how should financial institutions prepare to defend those systems in an area of heightened consumer scrutiny, especially if federal oversight recedes, as it seems to be right now?
So outside of the typical GRC, right, governance, or the, sort of government affairs, regulatory and compliance, right, functions that a lot of these companies have, we suggest that companies make sure that they're aligning stakeholders internally to label their data sets properly, know where all the training data is, how that's being used for these new tools. Also, any new vendors that they decide to bring on, understanding what are the AI models that those vendors are using and where is data heading to and from for those vendors, right? I think those are the most critical pieces to keep in mind. And then also understand that a lot of the sort of, requirements around these regulations will be enforced by the state attorney generals, right? At the state level. We don't foresee the federal regulatory bodies doing much of this, at least not for now.
Yeah. Well, certainly during the remainder of Trump's term.
Correct.
If the Democrat comes into office 3.5 years, that could change things quite dramatically, I would think. So let me go back to California for a minute. You mentioned the California statute, and California has a privacy law that has become, I would say, a national model. And with this new push to condition federal funding on deregulatory environments, do you think that California is going to continue to retain its leadership role, or do you see new regulatory power centers emerging?
It's a great question. My opinion is that California will continue to keep that power, and that's fundamentally due to the fact that, I would venture to say over 80% of these foundational model companies and the talent building all of this is in Silicon Valley. It's all there. So I think it's, we've seen one-off companies move their headquarters, like Tesla, move to Texas and whatnot. In-N-Out, not in the tech sector, but In-N-Out is also moving, I believe, to Texas, which that's going to be a fun one to see how that plays out. But it's another thing to say that an entire industry and the workforce, right, is all in Silicon Valley. So that's not going to happen anytime soon. And I think that's honestly the leverage that California has in the space.
Right. So you've compared this AI wave to the social media Wild West. What are the key lessons that financial institutions should learn from how these platforms were regulated or failed to be in the past?
So what happened with sort of consumer data privacy, in the social media era, was that it took a while for government to catch up. What's interesting is that now government knows that it took a while for them to catch up, and so they're trying to preempt that and work faster, which is a positive sign, in my opinion, right? Like we're starting to see these state legislatures, bring in experts into these hearings, right, as they create the bills. So that's all very positive. So I think it's more important than ever for these companies to stay abreast of what's going on across the state legislatures. Use tools like Abstract or any other monitoring tools to know what's going on with the bills and the proposed changes to regulations. Hire a lobbyist, join a trade association, right? Really have an understanding of what's going on because it's going to move faster.
So let's say you're an institution that's got multi-state operations and you're facing a patchwork of AI laws. What do you do? I've heard people say that designing something to comply with Colorado's framework is the best strategy. But does the federal policy shift here suggest something that's a more flexible state-specific compliance model?
Well, I'll say after working with over 300 lobbying firms and law firms in this space, it depends, right? But high level, we still think California and Colorado are some of the good model sets of policy to map your strategy around. But then it depends on whether or not you want to be fully compliant or you want to tweak some sort of product roadmap internally or do nothing, right? It depends on your product. It depends on your labor force, right? If your labor is involved or your operations, right? Those are typically the three main things that are impacted.
Right. Okay. So you've emphasized that adjusting compliance early before laws are finalized is something that should be done. What does that really look like now? Tracking these hundreds of bills across 40 or more states, or focusing on where the federal funding and enforcement pressure shifts?
Yeah, so this is where, we always push for being proactive instead of reactive. Policies, it's only going to get more complex over time. It's just the nature of how government works as the country ages, right? So in terms of being proactive, it's, again, being able to join trade associations that are able to give you updates on the latest bills and policy that may impact you. If you can hire a lobbyist or an in-house consultant to do that, that's great. And then using monitoring tools in our space as well, like Abstract, right, to proactively identify what may impact your product and then figure out how you can tweak that right now instead of waiting, let it become something that's out of compliance and then you're hit with fines, right? So this is really important. I would say more so than ever before, really.
As algorithmic discrimination becomes a central concern in state AI laws, can you give a few examples from banking or lending where consumers could end up facing harm and how regulators or plaintiffs are likely to respond?
Absolutely. So, where there's harm, right, for example, is, underwriting model that's trained on historical credit data. They find patterns that associate the zip code, the educational level, title, et cetera, right, with risk. And then it unintentionally denies a loan, right, more often to a certain class, right, Black or Latino applicants, as we've seen, right? So we're already seeing these issues with deterministic models. We're going to see that with these probabilistic models, these large language models. And so where the regulators are going to step in is say, okay, you need to tell us, where is all the training data? Where is all the data that you're using for these models to make these decisions? And then you need to show us exactly how it's going through all these steps and how you're creating these guardrails, right? As we mentioned earlier.
So you've said that smart companies can turn compliance into a competitive edge. Can you give us an example of how a bank or fintech might use AI governance to actually build trust or brand value beyond simply not getting fined?
Yeah, that's a great one. So I would say a very simple example with the customer success, right? Example, which is these models are already, I would say production level, right? Ready to be used for the consumer to handle consumer requests, right? So if a bank wants to tout how they have the best best customer service process, right? They can get ahead, understand what they need to disclose, what they need to sort of set up as they train their customer success model with data, and use that to be ahead in rolling that out, right? And that's going to be an advantage amongst the sea of terrible customer service call centers, right? So that's one of many where, if you understand where these frameworks are, you can just, modify your product roadmap and stay ahead of the curve.
Right. Okay. We've really come to the end of our program today, Pat. And I want to thank you very much for being our guest today. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of developments happening in this field that your company is involved in. And maybe in the future, after we see an increasing number of companies come out with AI models and use them in, fraud detection, credit underwriting, customer service. We'll see where the pain points are. And we may want to have you come back on our program. But very thankful to you for taking your time to be with us and to share your thoughts.
Absolutely. I appreciate Alan, and would love to join as well for a litmus test once we see all this play out.
To make sure you don't miss any of our future episodes, you should subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platform, be it Apple, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Don't forget to check out our blog, consumerfinancemonitor.com, for daily insights on the consumer finance industry. And if you have any questions or suggestions for our show, please email us at podcast, that's podcast singular, at ballardspar.com. And stay tuned each Thursday for a new episode of our show. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good day.